Hey friends, welcome or welcome back. My name is Shannon, and today we are going to talk about all of the books that I finished in June. Let's get this first one out of the way, which was actually a DNF, something I very rarely do, but I figured this year is the year that I'm going to allow myself to not force myself to finish books that I'm just not that interested in. The book that I DNF'd is The Henna Artist by Alka Joshi. In this story, we are following 17-year-old Lakshmi as she escapes an abusive husband and makes a life for herself in 1950s India. And she becomes a highly requested henna artist to very wealthy women in the city. Many years later, her husband finds her and shows up at her door, and with him is a sister of Lakshmi that she didn't even know existed. Needless to say, Lakshmi is stunned when her husband shows up because in this life that she made for herself, nobody knows that she is married and nobody knows that she is from a poor background. So this incident here with the husband showing up could ruin her and her career. She takes in the sister named Radha and cares for her, feeds her, clothes her, educates her. And Radha is a teenager who has no idea how tenuous her sister's situation is. And like many teenagers, she is ungrateful and doesn't think before she acts, which basically threatens everything that Lakshmi has worked for. There was really nothing wrong with the writing or the story, but for whatever reason, I just had no interest in finishing this book, and I didn't really care about the characters or the story. And I DNF'd it around 60%. This was a digital download. And I just have no better explanation that it was just not holding my attention and I had no desire to pick it back up. But like I said, I'm trying to be better at not forcing myself to read books that I have absolutely no interest in. The next two books that I finished in June were Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen and Emma by Jane Austen. If you remember, I am taking a course on Jane Austen and we are reading through all of her novels, and these two obviously are part of the course. I'm not going to talk about these books in this video because I am planning on doing a longer video, hopefully in July for Jane Austen July, but I will mention that Pride and Prejudice is my June pick for the Massachusetts Center of the Book Reading Challenge that I am doing. And the prompt for June was a book that inspired a film or television series. And as we know, Pride and Prejudice has two major adaptations that everybody either loves or hates. You've got the 1995 version with Colin Firth and Jennifer Ely, and then you have the 2005 movie with Keira Knightley and Matthew Macfadyen. Now, my original June pick was actually not Pride and Prejudice. It was originally Les Miserables, but I was never able to get around to it. And so I am going to kick the can a little on Les Miserables. I'm still hoping to get to it this year, probably this month. But I decided that since I was already reading Jane Austen, I just swapped it out because it was a relevant book for the prompt. The next book that I finished in June was Jane Austen's Letters, collected and edited by Deirdre LaFay, and this is the fourth edition of this particular book. And this was such a pleasure to read. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I started this in March, and I read a letter every morning with my coffee, and I just absolutely loved it. This wasn't part of the course that I'm taking, but I really wanted to get a better sense of Jane's personal writings and her thoughts and her observations, and this really did the trick. A lot of people consider these letters mundane because they contain local gossip, fashion, food, snarky comments about friends, neighbors, family. Very few letters contain anything about her reading or writing. There are a few, but not that many. And I do think a lot of people look down on her letters because they contain such mundane topics. But you are really getting a slice of life in Regency England at this time, especially this particular class that Jane was a part of. She obviously wasn't part of the working class. She was part of the pseudo gentry, you may call it. She was a clergyman's daughter, and the clergymen were considered at that time part of the gentry, even though they worked for a living and they generally didn't own any land. But if you were a gentleman, a proper occupation was a clergyman. So these letters are for a particular class in Regency society. So do take that into account. And one thing we should also take into account, that we are not getting in these letters many deep thoughts of Jane Austen. We're not getting any hopes and dreams or disappointments in these letters, because Cassandra, her sister, burned many of her letters after her death. In addition to purging, she also censored a lot of the letters in the 1840s, because she did will a lot of Jane's letters to members of the family. So she actually censored them before she gave them the letters. So we're not getting a lot of the deep, dark secrets that maybe Jane had. And she wouldn't have put many of those things in writing anyway, because she and Cassandra were very rarely apart. Most of the letters in here are to her sister Cassandra. There are a handful to nephews and nieces, and a one or two to some of her brothers, but the bulk of the letters in here, there's about 160 letters. That's all that's left. There were a few letters that did reference her own writing, but they were generally in passing, and usually to one of her brothers saying that, she made a little bit of money on this. And she has a letter to one of her brothers who is in the Navy asking if she can use the names of some of his old ships in her story. So I really did try to grasp at any mention of her books in these letters, but there really isn't much. So if you're going to read these, you're really just going to get an idea of how funny Jane is, how snarky she is, and how judgmental she can be. And one of the reasons that Cassandra purged and or censored the letters is because historians think she was trying to protect family members from seeing what she actually wrote about them. So she was very observant, and you can tell that she was observant because those observations make it into her novels. Highly, highly recommend this book. Next up is A Table for Two by Amor Towles. Towles is the author of A Gentleman in Moscow and Rules of Civility. And the first half of this book consists of 6 short stories, all set in New York. The stories are subtle and understated, yet Towles really gets you to love these characters in only just a few pages, where the characters are flawed and are exploring political and moral issues. And then the second half of the book is a novella called Eve in Hollywood, which is kind of a continuation of Rules of Civility. When the novel Rules of Civility ends, Eve is on a train back home to the Midwest, but then decides to keep going to California. And the book ends before you actually know what really happened to Eve. I would suggest reading Rules of Civility before reading Eve in Hollywood, because there is a major plot point from Rules of Civility that is spoiled in here. I was not crazy about Eve in Hollywood. I didn't think it was really necessary, and I would have preferred a full book of short stories. I just wasn't crazy about the novella. The short stories is where the book shines. I will link a very in-depth review of this by A Book Olive. She did an excellent job reviewing this and also talking about Rules of Civility and Eve in Hollywood. She considers herself a super fan of Rules of Civility, so I will link that video and you can get a better understanding how Eve in Hollywood and Rules of Civility are connected. That being said, I really enjoyed the short stories, so I do recommend that. And if you are a super fan of Rules of Civility, I also recommend. Next up is 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. In this story, we are following Ava and Shane, who met when they were teenagers and had a very intense relationship over 7 Days in June. 15 years later, they are both famous writers, and they meet at a literary event where sparks fly and past buried trauma comes to the surface. We follow them for another 7 days as they reconnect, rediscover their chemistry, and come to terms with their past. This is considered a romance book. However, this is not light and fluffy. It's actually quite dark, which I was not expecting. Shane and Ava are quite flawed, quite broken, and I totally bought them as love interests. They really did seem like real people. However, if they were real people, I would have begged them not to be together. They both had too many issues and too much old trauma, and they really probably should not be together. The chemistry between them was great, and there were some spicy scenes, but I didn't find them gratuitous. Correction, there was one scene that I could have done without, and it was actually the opening chapter. And it was a scene where Ava chokes on a piece of gum while she's masturbating. It was very strange and did nothing for the story. I don't even recall it ever being mentioned again. So, except for that opening scene, all of the other spicy scenes were not bothersome to me. So, I didn't mind them. There is also this side thread where Ava is exploring her roots and trying to learn about the strong Black women that came before her in her family, such as her grandmother and great-grandmother, about how those women navigated the American South as Black women. I found that thread to be really interesting, and I would actually be interested if Williams wrote a story on those women. My favorite character was Ava's daughter, who was about 13 years old. She was very insightful and appeared to be the only adult in the room. There are some trigger warnings, and so please check them before you read this book. There is teenage drug use, teenage self-harm, alcoholism, addiction, sexual assault, and chronic illness. So before you read this book, please check the trigger warnings. Like I said, this is actually a very dark romance. That being said, I did enjoy it, and I will check out some of Tia Williams' other works, but I likely will not read this. If I'm going to reread a romance, it needs to be something that's going to make me feel good. And I didn't always feel good when I read this book. I did enjoy it, but when I'm looking for a feel-good romance, this will not be it. Next, we have Pineapple Street by Jenny Jackson. This story is told from the point of view of 3 female members of the very, very wealthy Stockton family. We have Darlie, who is navigating marriage and motherhood and who gave up her job and her inheritance to have both. We have Sasha, who is a middle-class woman who married into the Stockton family but is treated as an outsider. Last, we have Georgiana, the youngest Stockton, who has fallen in love and trying to deal with her changing attitudes towards money and how it should be used. This is essentially a book about rich people problems, and I really don't care about rich people or their problems. It touched a little bit on the morality and responsibility of inherited wealth, but it really wasn't explored in depth. And if this were a witty and satirical book, I probably would have liked it better, but it was just fine. There really wasn't a whole lot to the story, and I really didn't care about the characters, so it left me unsatisfied and bored. So that's all I have to say about Pineapple Street. Next, we have Nobody is Ever Missing by Catherine Lacey. Here, we are following a woman trying to escape her life and herself. Illyria walks out of her New York apartment, boards a one-way flight to New Zealand, not telling anyone, not her husband, not her family, not her employer, and just disappears. We learn about how she navigates through New Zealand, making her way to a remote homestead on the basis of some half-hearted invitation from some random poet that she met at a party. You know, the type of invitation that's like, hey, if you're ever in the area, come hang out. You know, but this guy lives so remote, I'm sure he knows that nobody is ever going to be in that area. Well, she is heading to that area to see him. At first glance, this might appear to be your typical privileged white woman needs to find herself book, but it is not that. Through stream of consciousness writing, we see people that she meets, specifically through hitchhiking, random places she sleeps. She's found sleeping in parks and barns and quasi-cultish communities, and she also takes in some odd jobs. As we follow her from place to place, we learn about the suicide of her sister and how she meets her husband because of her sister's death, and how that has affected their entire relationship. Her thoughts start out as perfectly reasonable, insightful, and funny, but then they spiral into what the actual fuck. And this stream of consciousness writing, this spiraling, is done so beautifully that I just was absolutely stunned. I couldn't tell, is she ill? She often has these thoughts that she has a wildebeest renting a room in her, and she's forever trying to get rid of the wildebeest, or at least trying to not let it escape. As we go on, she becomes less relatable and less reliable as a narrator, and by the end of the book, I am just tired of her shit, and I really don't care what happens to her. And I'm pretty sure that's intentional. I'm pretty sure that's Lacey's intention. I was just done with this woman. And I felt bad because I was torn between not caring what happens to her and pity because she could be mentally ill. The title, Nobody Is Ever Missing, comes from the last line in Dream Song 29 by John Berryman, who was a poet whose own father committed suicide, and the poet himself committed suicide. I read the poem, but I didn't understand it. And from what I could tell, the character in the poem, in order to convince himself that he isn't crazy and went and killed people, he constantly goes over the people in his life. And every time he does that, he determines that nobody is ever missing. So he counts through the people in his life. He determines nobody in his life is missing, so thus he hasn't killed them. There is no resolution to this story except to learn that nobody can ever go missing from themselves. If you are into beautiful prose, stream of consciousness writing, and an ending that is not resolved, you will love this book. I liked it. I was on board for the first half of it. I really was. I marked so many passages because they were just so beautiful. But like I said, and I'm sure it was Lacey's intention, I was just done with this woman. I just did not care what happened to her. And so when the non-resolution finally arrived, when the ending was there, I was like, well, have a nice life. I just did not care. I am going to put in the description box the link to a review of this book that I found from 2015 when this was first published. It talks about Dream Song 29, and I found that review very helpful in helping me understand this book a little bit better and getting a little bit of a background on where the title came from. The last book that I finished in June was Less by Andrew Sean Greer. This was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize in 2018, and about halfway through the book, our protagonist is describing his latest novel. He is writing about a middle-aged gay man walking around San Francisco and said man's sorrows. The woman he is speaking to says to him, "A white middle-aged American man walking around with his white middle-aged sorrows? It's hard to feel sorry for a guy like that, even if he is gay." Well, this book is exactly that. We are following Arthur Less, a white, middle-aged, gay American man, not necessarily walking around San Francisco. He lives in San Francisco, but he is actually traveling around the world, thinking constantly about his sorrows. Arthur is a minor novelist whose claim to fame is not his writing, but having been the lover of a very famous poet during most of Arthur's youth. At the time the book starts, Arthur has spent the last 10 years in a not so committed relationship with a much younger man, and said much younger man is about to get married. To avoid the wedding, Arthur takes on a whole bunch of writing related and teaching gigs across the world so that he doesn't have to attend the wedding and he can ignore his broken heart that he doesn't quite realize is broken. Each chapter is Arthur in a different country. He goes to Mexico for a panel discussion on his ex-lover's work, then on to Italy for an award ceremony because apparently the translation of his early book is better than the original. He then goes to Germany to teach a writing course, then on to Morocco for the birthday party of a friend, and he won't spend his own 50th birthday alone. Then he goes to India to work on rewriting his current book. Remember how I mentioned a few seconds ago his, white middle-aged man feeling sorry for himself? He's hoping to rewrite that. And then lastly, we find him in Japan writing an article about Japanese food. In each country, we see in real time Arthur's midlife crisis unfolding, and we also get flashbacks to various points in his life, showing how Arthur has just been eaten up by the world, essentially tripping and falling through life, both in work and in love. At first, I felt just as that woman felt. Who really cares about some middle-aged man walking around feeling sorry for himself? Who cares? And that's originally how I felt. I didn't really feel bad for this middle-aged guy who can't get out of his own way. But there were a few scenes near the end that were so touching and written so lovely that I couldn't help just wanting to hug him and tell him that it was going to be okay. I did end up liking the book, and I likely will read it again because there were many funny moments and buried literary references, and it was also a queer story, not about trauma and despair. That was one of the author's goals, being able to acknowledge the difficulty of being gay, but also the possibility of joy. I felt that the ending was perfect. I loved it. And because of that, I'm actually not going to read the sequel, Less is Lost. So if you would like to read about a non-traumatic queer story about a white middle-aged man feeling a little bit sorry for himself and trying to mend his broken heart, I highly recommend this book. All right, so that's it for June. Now, upcoming for July, I do have lots of classics happening. I need to finish the last 2 Jane Austen novels for my course, and that would be Mansfield Park and Persuasion. Persuasion is actually going to be my July pick for the Massachusetts Center of the Book Challenge, which the prompt is a book by an author born out of the United States. Originally, I had The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford as my pick, but since I was already reading this, I just decided to swap it out so that I could read a couple of other things in July. One of the other things I do want to read in July is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm picking this up in July because the world premiere of the musical The Great Gatsby is at the American Repertory Theater here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I have tickets for the end of the month, so I'm hoping to read this before I actually see the production. Next, I'm also going to try to read, not this whole book, I'm going to try to read The Winter's Tale by William Shakespeare because I am going to see a production of The Winter's Tale in Boston. During the summer, the Commonwealth Shakespeare Company does free outdoor performances of Shakespeare every summer. I used to go all of the time. I haven't been in a couple of years, so I'm very much looking forward to seeing this production. The last classic that I'm going to try to get started is Les Miserables. I mentioned this earlier that it was originally a pick for my reading challenge, but I never got around to it. I mean, look at the size of this thing. But I really want to start it and try to at least finish it by August because I am seeing a production of it in August. I have actually never seen Les Mis. I haven't seen the play. I haven't seen any of the movies. I haven't read the book, nothing. And for someone who studied theater and was a performer for many years, it's quite an oversight. I don't have high hopes of me actually finishing this. I'm hoping to at least start it before the production so I can get an idea of it, but we'll see what happens. Those 5 books are the only ones that I'm actually going to focus on reading in July. I do have a couple here that if I can get to, great. If I don't, I'm not going to cry about it. And the first one would be Big Swiss by Jen Began. I did start the first chapter of this a month or 2 ago, but I never picked it up again. And this is basically about a woman who is a transcriber for a sex therapist, and during her work she becomes obsessed with one of the patients. I don't know much more about it. I did enjoy the first chapter when I read it, and I am looking forward to reading it, but whether I pick it up in July, I'm not really sure. And because it is summer, I do want to try to pick up Stories for Summer and Days by the Pool. This is a short story collection published by the British Library Women's Writers, and it has a whole bunch of summary short stories by authors such as Catherine Mansfield, Virginia Woolf, Elizabeth Bowen, Daphne du Maurier, Elizabeth Taylor, not that Elizabeth Taylor, the other Elizabeth Taylor, Sylvia Townsend Warner, and Muriel Spark. So if I can pick this up in July, great. If not, maybe in August. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great day. Bye.